64 Wars, also known as Advance Wars 64, was a planned Nintendo 64 game that was going to be the next entry to Nintendo's Wars franchise. That first started with the release of Famicom Wars for the Famicom in 1988. And as of making this video, the latest release in the franchise was Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp for the Nintendo Switch in 2023. The game was showcased at Space World 1999, with it due to be released on January 29, 1999. And it would have had the same format as the other Wars games, where it would be a tactical role-playing game, in which players would oversee a 2D map, but when battles would occur, the battles would render in 3D. Additionally, the game was going to utilize the Game Boy Transfer Pack with Game Boy Wars 2 to gain access to several features, such as the ability to transfer match progress between the systems. And the menu for this function still appears in Game Boy Wars 2, although it is unable to be used. Ultimately, 64 Wars would end up getting cancelled for unknown reasons, although we still got screenshots and footage from it that have since surfaced. However, we still have yet to find any playable build of it. Sometime during the early 2000s, after Microsoft would purchase Rare, Rare would begin development on two new Banjo-Kazooie games for the Xbox, which were called Banjo-Free, which is also known as Banjo-X, and Banjo-Kazoomie. However, I will only be talking about Banjo-Kazooie as, well, that's what this entry is named after. Anyways, Banjo-Kazooie would begin development sometime in 2004 after the release of Rare's Xbox exclusive game, Grabbed by the Ghoulies. And the game would involve players being able to construct their own vehicles and race against characters from the Banjo-Kazooie franchise and other Rare series, which sounds quite similar to the Banjo-Kazooie game Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, except for being able to race against characters from other series made by Rare. And who knows, maybe Banjo-Kazooie evolved into Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts after its cancellation. Before the game was cancelled, a prototype of it was in the process of being completed, and one of the prototype's developers named Brendan Gunn would comment on its development saying, quote, "I've always wanted to do a racing game. I got to spend 2 weeks working on a prototype racing game for the Xbox. It was codenamed Banjo-Kazooie, and it was a kind of kart racer, but you constructed the karts out of different parts. So I guess it was kind of a precursor to Nuts and Bolts. But for those 2 weeks, I was doing the driving mechanics for it." Upon the game getting cancelled, many believed that it was a working title for the 2005 Game Boy Advance game Banjo Pilot. However, that was eventually proven to not be true. As of making this video, no builds of the prototype of Banjo-Kazooie have been leaked online, and no gameplay from it can be found. At the 2018 Reboot Develop Conference, Yuta Saito, who was previously known for creating such games such as Seaman, SimTower, and Automa, would reveal a new Nintendo DS game that was to be the next installment to the Mario Kart franchise called Mario Motors. And during the reveal, he would bring up the story of how the game was first conceived, in which he would say that during the early 2000s, he would meet up with Shigeru Miyamoto and the former president of Nintendo, Satoru Iwata, where they would usually chat about game ideas while having some tea. During one meeting, Saito was asked by Iwata on what he was interested in lately, to which he would say sculpting chunks of metal before explaining his crazy idea to Iwata and Miyamoto while they sat in silence. And in the end, both Iwata and Miyamoto would find the project to be interesting, making them give it a try. Despite Mario Motors being a part of the Mario Kart franchise, it was going to feature a new concept that no Mario Kart game has ever featured before, which was giving players the ability to build engines and presumably other parts of vehicles out of chunks of metal, such as shaving and sculpting metal into a cylinder that can be added into an engine, deciding the ability of said engine, for example. And the game was also going to add the ability for you to blow into the DS mic into a part of the game that teaches acceleration. However, that idea would end up getting scrapped because of the fear of players losing their breath. The game would ultimately end up getting cancelled for unknown reasons, and it is unknown how much of the game was centered around racing, as no tracks were ever announced and only 2 characters were shown in concept art, which were Mario and an unknown elderly scientist character. During E3 2001, Nintendo accidentally showed a press release that showed 3 upcoming Mario games that were to be released in the future. And they were Super Mario Sunshine, Super Mario 128, and a game that would eventually end up getting cancelled and become a very mysterious lost game called Marionette. And after the press release was shown, it was quickly pulled. Later, in August 2001, Shigeru Miyamoto would do an interview with IGN in which he would bring up the game saying, quote, "And as for Marionette, it is still under development. It is not a Mario game, but an actual marionette game utilizing a puppet. I am hoping to make something both complicated and simple at the same time, which is kind of a contradiction. But already we are experimenting. And once again, sometime in the future we may be able to show you something on it." In an IGN article, Miyamoto talks about how Marionette was toyed around in concept stages for the Nintendo 64 and GameCube, but never really gotten developed into a full game, where he said, quote, "Marionette is probably more suited for something like the Wii. However, that type of game is difficult. Just looking at it, it seems to be fun, but then you get the feeling of, well, what do I do now?" And what Miyamoto meant by saying that was that he felt the game wouldn't last because it didn't have a strong story. Something that Super Mario Sunshine had that Marionette and even Super Mario 128 didn't have. And not only did Miyamoto think the game was better to be released on the Wii, but Japanese Nintendo game magazine Nintendo Dream would also think the same thing too, saying that the game would be perfect for the Wii, as manipulating a marionette would be more enjoyable using the Wii remote, as well as also mentioning that the Japanese spelling of the game's title breaks down perfectly to Mario and net, suggesting that the game might have had network features. Ultimately, Marionette would end up never releasing on the GameCube and any Nintendo console that came after it, and Miyamoto would share some partially disappointing news about the development of the game, saying, quote, "We're not working on it anymore. However, we'd like to release something like it with the right timing, so we're preserving it in the form of its story elements. When Marionette was being planned, we were trying to use the N64 controller in interesting ways. However, if we now use the Wii Remote controller, it seems that those types of interesting elements would appear more naturally." As of making this video, no photos from the game have surfaced on the internet, and it is unknown what the game was going to be about, besides involving a marionette, of course. Out of the Deathmount was a cancelled Virtual Boy game from J-Wing that was supposed to be released on March 1st, 1996. And if you guys are familiar with the history of the Virtual Boy, then you will know that March 1st, 1996 was not long before the console was discontinued, with it being discontinued in August of 1996 in North America and on December 22nd, 1995 in Japan, which was before that date. And the reason why the Virtual Boy was not only discontinued, but discontinued just 1 year after its release in North America, was due to it receiving so much negative reception from critics and those who bought it, thus causing it to sell poorly. And to be more specific as to why the console had such poor reception, it was received poorly due to its high price, ability to display only the colors red and black, poor ergonomics that caused many to feel discomfort while looking through its linear arrays, and health concerns due to it giving many players headaches, dizziness, nausea, and eye pain. Because the Virtual Boy was received poorly, Out of the Deathmount never ended up releasing. And not much is known about the game, although based on various screenshots and articles, it would have been a first-person shooter game where the player would be given 2 guns to shoot enemies with, which were likely going to be both controlled by the Virtual Boy's dual D-pads. An interesting thing I should mention is that Out of the Deathmount may have not even been the game's title, but instead a title made for the pre-release stages of the game. Now, despite there not being much available information about it, a prototype of it might still be around, as the game was displayed at Famicom Space World 1995. And for anyone trying to find the possible prototype, good luck. Because J-Wing may not still be around to this day, as the last game they developed was Animal Breeder 4, which was released in 2001. So for now, the only things you will ever see that are related to Out of the Deathmount are some screenshots from it and articles mentioning it. Pikachu DS was a tech demo that Nintendo shown at E3 2004. That was meant to show off the Nintendo DS's features, which was their newest console at the time. The game starred, you guessed it, Pokemon's Pikachu, who was used to show off the DS's 3D graphics, microphone, and touchscreen, and be used to engage in various activities with, such as grabbing and stretching its body parts with the DS's stylus, tracing a picture of him with the stylus, using the stylus to scratch off scratch cards, playing a guitar and a xylophone with the stylus, and measuring Magikarp that Pikachu caught. Outside of E3 2004, the tech demo never surfaced elsewhere, and no ROM of it is known to exist. However, the 3D model of Pikachu that was used for Pikachu DS was later reused for the DS game Pokemon Dash, and it even had the same functions too. Considering that Pikachu DS was only a tech demo and was never meant to be an official game, it's highly unlikely that it will ever resurface.
Ja, det här är ju visningsgrej vad man kan göra med Pikachu och med ringar och tala om vad man ska prata med.
Return of Donkey Kong is a game that Nintendo ended up canceling that was planned to release on the NES in either 1987 or 1988. With it being another entry to Nintendo's Donkey Kong franchise. And despite the game being an entry to one of the most popular franchises at the time, we don't have enough proof to even say that it existed, with there being only 2 pieces of evidence to prove that the game might have existed. The first being its mention in the official Nintendo Player's Guide in 1987, where it was listed as a quote-unquote upcoming attraction. And the second being its mention in the 5th issue of a Nintendo Fun Club magazine from 1988. It is unknown if the game ever got some development for it before its cancellation. And based on the few advertisements for it, it seems like Return of Donkey Kong would have the player play as Donkey Kong and be able to throw barrels like in the original Donkey Kong arcade game. As of now, there are currently no images of the game that can be seen online. And we will likely never see any images from the game as the game was never publicly shown off. Yooka-Laylee was a platformer game that was first released in 2017 for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, macOS, PC, and Linux in April of that year, and later the Nintendo Switch in December of that year. However, at one point, a Wii U port of the game was in development and was being considered to release in stores in the future. The game's plot is basically about a chameleon named Yuka and a bat named Laylee who go on a quest to retrieve a magical book from an evil corporation known as the Ivory Towers Corporation. And upon its release, it ended up receiving mixed to average reviews on the PC, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One, while its Nintendo Switch port on the other hand received much more favorable reviews. Oh yeah, I should also mention that Yooka-Laylee is a spiritual successor to the Banjo-Kazooie series, which makes sense when you take into consideration that a group of former members from Rare, who were known for developing the Banjo-Kazooie games, were developers for this game. Now, I mentioned earlier about a cancelled Wii U port of Yooka-Laylee, but I didn't mention why it was cancelled, so I'll tell you now. The port ended up getting cancelled in late 2016 because of unforeseen technical difficulties, and so they can focus on development of the Switch port of the game. And up until its cancellation, it was available to pre-order on Kickstarter. However, because of its cancellation, anyone that pre-ordered it on Kickstarter could exchange it for a port of the game on a different system. That way, no one would get scammed. And alternatively, they were also able to upgrade to a Nintendo Switch port or request a refund.